Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your leadership in holding this hearing. I appreciate the terrific testimony from our witnesses. And I also applaud our chairman for his engagement in a bipartisan way on the Blue Pacific Act and the Honoring Oceania Act. And I'd love to talk to the chairman about those pieces of legislation, see if I can be helpful to you on those. And I want to turn to Ms. Pascal on her testimony. And you do a great job, Ms. Pascal, in your written testimony towards the end where you get into granular detail on specific recommendations. And so in reference to the Blue Pacific Act and the Honoring Oceania Act and the previous administration's more active engagement of the Pacific Islands, can you give us a little bit more detail on the top priorities? So if we're to pass legislation on Oceania and the Pacific Islands, what would be the absolute top key priorities for us to further engage those islands? And I appreciate the testimony that we need to be comprehensive in our approach and not be, focused exclusively on China. But let's face it, that's the big issue. So how can we? What would you say are the top 3, 4, 5 pieces of engagement that we need to be focused on?
Thank you, Representative Barr. That's the key question. And the legislation is in place, is there, and the money seems to be floating around. The problem is that it isn't being targeted in a very specific way. And one element is what Mr. Loy brought up, which is that there isn't a comprehensive team within the U.S. that's looking at how to engage. So if you've got a pool of money for infrastructure, it may go into a whole bunch of different things that don't aggregate into something that actually helps the people of the region and create those bonds. So one is, as he said, you put people there, but the other is, and this hasn't really been brought up before, a lot of these countries have very small ministries of foreign affairs. So they might have 5 or 6 people dealing with everything from COP to defense to everything else, and they don't know how the U.S. works. So Palau tried to get around this recently by putting in place a national security coordinator so they would have a designated person to talk to the security establishment in the U.S. and create those bonds. Similar initiatives would be very helpful across the countries of the Pacific, where you help them understand. You have how the U.S. works, how the U.S. systems work, and how to put in place individuals that can be that consistent point of contact for the U.S. going in, so that the lines of communication are very entrenched. I would also, as we're building out the Quad, make sure that India is included in a lot of these issues, including with the funding for some of these projects, because as mentioned, for infrastructure, we're looking mostly now at Japan, Australia, New Zealand. They're very expensive infrastructure. So what you end up with, for example, is Japan will build a hospital in Tonga and it'll be staffed by Chinese doctors. Through the Quad, you can bring in the lower cost Indian components that can help bolster that on the ground engagement that reinforce the Quad and reinforce the free and Indo-Pacific as a whole. So those would be kind of 2 of the things that I would prioritize. One is making sure they know how to understand and talk to the U.S. And the second is bring in this other element of India, which can go into the sectors of the economy where China is currently filling in order to give them another viable option.
Okay, any other, just same question briefly to any of our other witnesses. What would be the top recommendation in any kind of Oceania engagement legislation? I mean, I like the Peace Corps idea, and soft power, but what about DFC? Where can DFC counter Chinese economic influence?
I mean, Congressman, absolutely anything on infrastructure I think is important. I mean, we do need to be able to offer an alternative to what China's offering. Other pieces of engagement that have been really popular beyond this Peace Corps are the Coast Guard shipwriter program that Ambassador Sefkin mentioned. Most of the Pacific Islands don't have militaries, right? So it's the military to military piece can be a bit more difficult. And then I think the other piece of it is ensuring that there is a stream of funding that can't be disrupted on a year-to-year basis.
Yeah, and sorry, if I could add to this. So yeah, I agree completely with Mr. Loy on any type of Pacific Island Maritime Patrol that the U.S. would lead, but also I think it's important for the U.S. to look beyond the COFA states. I mean, when you look at the aid that the U.S. gives to the Pacific, 85% is directed to the compacts at the COFA states, and I think it's important to look around it.
And if I may just also mention one other program that's very promising is the State Partnership Program. When I was in the Pacific, we had a state partnership with the Nevada National Guard with Tonga, and that was hugely beneficial to our relationship and to both our countries. It's now, I'm happy to say, been expanded to Fiji, and Wisconsin Guard has taken on a partnership with PNG, but that's another place where you can have sustained engagement that is really advantageous. So that's another area I think to explore expanding.
Well, I'm proud to represent the Kentucky National Guard, and I would say that our guardsmen would not object to going to the South Pacific for a tour. So thank you all for your testimony. I yield back.